In the heart of the Arabian desert, beneath an endless expanse of stars too, men from vastly different worlds cross. Paths one bound by tradition carries a secret so profound it could chain everything the other, a wanderer. Searching for freedom becomes the key to unlocking his heart. Their journey begins here where the sands hold more than memories. They hold secrets, passion, and a love that defies the odds. Before we begin this captivating story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Stick with us to witness tale of love, secrets, and the courage to be true to yourself. The desert stretched endlessly before me, its golden dunes shimmering under the blazing sun. I had always sought solitude in my travels, but this time something felt different. The stillness of the Arabian desert was both comforting and unnerving, as if the sands themselves held secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. I had come here to write, to find inspiration for my next piece. My name is Elliot Hayes, a travel writer from Colorado who had spent years chasing stories in far-off lands. The desert was my latest muse, and I was determined to capture its essence. But even as I trudged through the shifting sands, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation, like something was waiting for me just beyond the next dune. My guide Zaid Amir walked ahead of me with the confidence of someone who belonged to this landscape. His flowing white robes moved gracefully with each step, and his face, though partially hidden by a scarf, exuded calm authority. I couldn't help but admire how effortlessly he navigated the terrain. The desert seemed to bend to his will. This way, Elliot, Zaid called over his shoulder, his deep voice cutting through the wind. The camp isn't far. I quickened my pace, catching up to him. How do you know where to go? Everything looks the same out here. Zaid glanced at me, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. The desert speaks if you know how to listen. His words lingered in the air, enigmatic and poetic. I wanted to ask more, to understand how someone could feel so connected to a place that seemed so unforgiving. But before I could, he pointed to a cluster of tents in the distance. There it is, we'll rest there for the night. As we approached the camp, I noticed how modest it was. Just a few beige tents arranged in a semicircle, with a fire pit in the center. It was a stark contrast to the luxury I was used to seeing in travel brochures, yet it felt authentic. I see, untouched by the trappings of modern tourism. Zaid helped me unload my bag from the camel and gestured toward one of the tents. You'll sleep there, I'll prepare tea. I nodded, grateful for the chance to rest, but as I sat down on a woven mat inside the tent, I couldn't shake the curiosity brewing inside me. Zaid was unlike anyone I had ever met, reserved yet commanding, with a presence that seemed larger than life. He intrigued me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert transformed. The oppressive heat gave way to a cool breeze, and the sky turned into a canvas of stars. I sat by the fire, pouring tea into small, ornate cups. The flickering flames cast shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the intensity in his gaze. I joined him, the warmth of the fire a welcome contrast to the chill of the night. Do you always bring travelers out Here I asked, taking a sip of the tea. It was strong and earthy, unlike anything I'd tasted before. Not often, he replied, his tone measured. Most people don't want the desert, they want hotels and air conditioning, but you seem different. The comment caught me off guard. Different? How? Zaid studied me for a moment, his eyes unreadable. You're not here for the usual reasons, you're searching for something. His words struck a nerve. He was right. I was searching for what I wasn't entirely sure. Meaning, purpose, connection. I wasn't used to being seen so clearly, and it unsettled me. What about you? I countered, deflecting the attention. Why do you stay out here? Zaid's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. The desert is honest, he said. Finally, it doesn't hide anything. It forces you to face yourself. His answer hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to press him to understand what he meant, but the vulnerability in his voice held me back. Instead, we sat in silence, the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind, our only companions. As the night deepened, Zaid stood and looked up at the sky. The stars are brighter here, he said quietly. You won't see this in the city. I followed his gaze, marveling at the vast expanse above us. It was breathtaking, the kind of beauty that made you feel small yet connected to something greater. Without thinking, I said, it's incredible, makes you wonder what else is out there. Zaid turned to me, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't out there, he said, his voice soft but steady. They're right in front of you. My breath caught at the weight of his words. For a moment it felt like he was talking about more than the stars, more than the desert. But before I could respond, he turned away, his silhouette blending into the shadows that night. As I lay in the quiet of the tent, I replayed our conversation in my mind. Zaid was a puzzle, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the desert itself. There was something about him that drew me in, something I couldn't explain. I stared up at the canvas roof of the tent, the faint light of the stars filtering through. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was on the brink of something extraordinary. Little did I know the journey ahead would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself. The next morning, the desert came alive with light. The sun stretched its golden fingers across the dunes, casting long shadows and warming the air with its gentle embrace. I awoke to the sound of camels grumbling softly, their silhouettes moving against the rising sun. For a moment I forgot where I was, caught between the tranquility of the desert and the faint echoes of dreams I couldn't quite remember. Zaid was already awake, tending to the fire and preparing breakfast. His movements were precise and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. I stepped out of the tent, stretching my arms against the cool morning breeze. Good morning, he said, without looking up. His voice calmed and steady. Morning, I replied, sitting cross-legged on the mat beside him. You're up early. The desert waits for no one, he said with a small smile, handing me a cup of steaming tea. Besides, I enjoy the quiet of the morning. I sipped the tea, letting its warmth seep into me. Do you ever get lonely out here? Zaid paused, his hands stilling for a moment before resuming their task. Loneliness isn't about where you are, he said. Thoughtfully, it's about what you carry. Inside his words lingered as we packed up camp and prepared to continue our journey. The day ahead promised more breathtaking vistas, and perhaps more of Zaid's quiet wisdom as we set out. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. He carried himself with a calm confidence, but beneath it I sensed a weight, something unspoken. As we treed through the dunes, I tried to get him to open up. You said the desert is honest. I began. What did you mean by that? Zaid glanced at me, his dark eyes catching the sunlight. Out here, there's no noise to distract you, no buildings to block your view. It strips everything away until you're left with yourself. And is that a good thing? I asked, genuinely curious. He smiled, faintly, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. It depends on what you're trying to hide. The weight of his response settled between us, and for a while we walked in silence. I wanted to ask him more, to uncover the layers of mystery surrounding him, but I knew better than to push. Zaid wasn't the kind of person to reveal himself easily. By midday, the sun was at its peak, and we stopped to rest under the shade of a rocky outcrop. Zaid handed me a small bundle of food, flatbread and dates, simple but satisfying. As we ate, I couldn't help but study him, noting the way his features softened when he wasn't speaking. He had the kind of face that told stories without words, each line and shadow testament to a life I couldn't begin to imagine. You're daring, he said suddenly, breaking my train of thought. I felt my cheeks flush. Sorry, I was just thinking about what I hesitated, unsure how much to share. About how you seem so at peace out here, like you belong. Zaid looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Belonging is complicated, he said after a long pause. Sometimes the place you feel most connected to is the one you can never fully be a part of. His words struck a chord, though I couldn't quite explain why. There was a vulnerability in his voice that I hadn't heard before, and it made me wonder what he was holding back. The desert, with all its openness, seemed to mirror Zaid's guarded nature, vast and breathtaking, yet impossible to fully grasp. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, we reached a small oasis. The sight of the water, surrounded by palm trees, felt like a gift after hours of trekking through the heat. Zaid knelt by the water's edge, cupping his hands to drink, and for a moment I saw him in a different light. There was something almost sacred about the way he moved, as though he were part of the desert itself. Why did you become a guide? I asked, breaking the silence. Zaid straightened his expression, thoughtful. Because it's the only place I feel free. The simplicity of his answer surprised me, free from what he hesitated, his gaze dropping to the water. Expectations, judgments, the weight of a life that doesn't feel like mine. I didn't press him further, sensing that he had said more than he intended, but his words stayed with me, filling the spaces between our conversations. As we set up camp for the night, later, as we sat by the fire, the sky came alive with stars. It was the kind of beauty that made you feel insignificant and infinite. All at once, Zod stared into the flames, his face illuminated by their flickering light. Do you ever feel like you're searching for something? He asked, suddenly, his voice low. All the time, I admitted. I think that's why I travel. I'm always looking for something, meaning maybe, or connection. He nodded his gaze. Distant, the desert has a way of giving you what you need, even if it's not what you expect. There was a heaviness in his words, a quiet confession hidden beneath their surface. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I too carried secrets and longings I couldn't put into words. But instead, I sat beside him in silence, letting the fire and the stars speak for us as the night wore on. The distance between us seemed to shrink. It wasn't just the physical closeness of sitting by the fire, it was something deeper, an unspoken connection that defied logic. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in my searching. Zaid, with all his mystery and quiet strength, felt like someone I was meant to find, and yet, as I looked at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, something that could change everything. The following day began like the others, with the golden sun stretching its light over the desert, warming the dunes and casting shadows in their endless curves. Yet something felt different. There was a tension in the air between Zaid and me, an unspoken weight lingering from the night before. His words about freedom, about escaping expectations, echoed in my mind as we packed up camp. We walked in silence for hours, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath our boots and the occasional whistle of the wind. Zaid's usual calm felt subdued, as though he were lost in thought. I wanted to ask him what was on his mind, but I didn't know how to bridge the growing distance between us. As the sun reached its peak, we stopped to rest under a rocky overhang. The shade provided a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat. I sat down, gulping water from my canteen, while Zaid leaned against the rocks, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're quiet today," I said, breaking the silence. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "The desert has that effect. Sometimes." I raised an eyebrow. "On you. You're usually the one telling me how alive this place is." A flicker of a smile crossed his face, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Even the desert can feel heavy when you carry too much." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I wanted to push to understand what he meant, but something in his demeanor stopped me. Instead, I decided to give him space, hoping he would open up when he was ready. As the day wore on, the terrain grew more challenging. The dunes became steeper, the sand looser underfoot. By the time we reached a small plateau overlooking a vast expanse of shimmering dunes, we were both exhausted. Zaid pointed to a flat area at the base of the plateau. "We'll camp there tonight," he said, his voice steady but tired. Once the tents were set up and the fire was lit, we sat together in silence, the crackling flames providing the only sound. I watched Zaid as he stared into the fire, his face illuminated by its warm glow. There was something about the way he held himself, so controlled, so measured, that made me wonder what it would take to break through his walls. "You said the desert forces you to face yourself," I began, my voice tentative. "What does it make you see?" Zaid didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and ran a hand through his hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and laced with vulnerability. "It makes me see who I am," he said, "and who I'm not allowed to be." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to reach out to offer him some kind of comfort, but I didn't know if he would accept it. Instead, I said, "You don't have to carry that alone." "You?" No, Zaid looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine for a moment. I thought he might say something, but then he looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's not that simple. It doesn't have to be complicated," I said, my voice softer. "Sometimes you just need to let someone in." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And then what? Watch them walk away when they see the truth." I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "You don't know that." He met my gaze then, and for the first time, I saw the raw pain he had been hiding. It was as if the desert's honesty had finally caught up to him, stripping away the mask he had so carefully constructed. The fire crackled between us, the flames casting shadows on Zaid's face. "I've spent my whole life pretending," he said, quietly, "pretending to be the son my family expects, that my culture demands. But it's a lie, and the truth would destroy everything." His confession hit me like a wave, and I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for the burden he carried, anger at the world that forced him to hide, and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "You don't have to pretend with me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Zaid looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty and something else, hope. Maybe. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, the firelight dancing between us, and then, as if compelled by some unseen force, he reached out. His hand hovered for a moment before resting gently on mine. The touch was hesitant, almost tentative, but it sent a surge of electricity through me. "I don't know how to stop pretending," he admitted, his voice trembling. "You start by letting yourself feel," I said, covering his hand with mine. "Whatever it is, don't push it away." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, that allowed us to say everything without uttering a word. For the first time, I felt like I was truly seeing Z. Not the guide, not the mask, but the man beneath it all. As the fire burned low and the stars emerged overhead, I realized that the journey we were on was about more than the desert. It was about discovery of ourselves, of each other, and of the courage it would take to face what came next. But even as the walls between us began to crumble, I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, and the secrets Zaid carried would test the fragile connection we had begun to build. The desert night had grown colder, but the fire between us seemed to burn brighter. Zaid's hand lingered in mine for a moment longer before he pulled away, his movement slow, as if reluctant to break the fragile connection we just shared. I wanted to hold on to that moment, to anchor us in the safety of honesty, but Zaid's eyes shifted to the fire, his expression unreadable. "Once more, thank you," he said softly, barely above a whisper. It was an acknowledgement, not just of my words, but of the space I had given him to be vulnerable, and yet the weight of his secrets lingered heavy and unyielding. The next morning, we resumed our journey in silence. The desert, usually a place of solace, felt different now, charged with the tension of unspoken truths. Zaid seemed more withdrawn than usual, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his movements mechanical. I wanted to ask what was on his mind, but I knew better than to push whatever he was grappling with. He wasn't ready to share it as we climbed a particularly steep dune. Zaid suddenly stopped, his breathing uneven. He turned to me, his expression strained. "There's something I need to tell you." The words hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. My heart pounded as I waited, unsure of what he was about to reveal. But before he could speak, a distant sound interrupted us, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle. A black SUV appeared on the horizon, its tires kicking up a cloud of sand as it sped toward us. Zaid's entire demeanor changed. In an instant, his posture stiffened, his jaw clenched, and his eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. "Stay behind me," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The SUV came to a halt a few meters away, and two men stepped out. They were dressed in crisp suits, an odd contrast to the rugged desert landscape. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, addressed Zaid in Arabic, his tone cold and authoritative. I didn't understand the words, but the tension between them was palpable. Zaid's responses were clipped, his voice low and controlled. He kept himself between me and the men, his stance protective. "What's happening?" I whispered, my pulse racing. Zaid glanced over his shoulder, his expression hard. "There from my family." The revelation hit me like a freight train. I had suspected that Zaid came from a traditional background, but the formality and hostility of these men suggested something far more complex and far more dangerous. The conversation continued, their words rapid and sharp. I could see the strain on Zaid's face, the way his hands clenched at his sides as he fought to maintain his composure. Finally, the men seemed to reach some sort of conclusion. They stepped back, giving Zaid one last look before returning to their vehicle. As the SUV disappeared over the dunes, I turned to Zaid, my chest tight with worry. "What was that about?" Zaid exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as the tension drained from his body. "They wanted to remind me of my responsibilities," he said bitterly, "to my family, to my name, to everything I've spent my life trying to escape." His words were laced with anger and pain, and I could see the cracks in the armor he'd so carefully constructed. For the first time, I realized just how much he was fighting against his culture, his family, his own fear. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Zaid," I said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever it is whatever they're holding over you, you can trust me." He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with conflict. For a long moment he didn't speak, and I thought he might shut me out again. But then he took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I'm engaged," he confessed, his voice barely audible to a woman I've never met. The admission hung between us, a heavy truth that seemed to suck the air out of the night. My heart sank as I tried to process what he just said. "Engaged," I repeated, my voice hollow. Zaid nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It's an arrangement, something my family expects of me, but I don't love her. I don't even know her." The pain in his voice was undeniable, and it cut through me like a blade. I wanted to be angry, to demand why he hadn't told me sooner, but all I could feel was sadness for him, for the impossible situation he was trapped In why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice trembling, because I didn't want to scare you away. He admitted, you're the first person who's made me feel free. Like I can be myself. I didn't want to lose that. His honesty was both heart breaking and affirming. I reached out, placing a hand on his. You don't have to live their life, Zaid. You can choose your own path. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. It's not that simple. My family's expectations aren't about me. They're about honor, tradition. Everything they've built there lives around. We sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I didn't know how to fix this, how to free him from the chains of obligation that bound him, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let him face it alone. As the fire burned low and the stars filled the sky, I made a silent vow, no matter what it took, I would help Zaid find the freedom he so desperately craved, even if it meant confronting the forces that had kept him trapped for so long. The oasis was still the only sound, the gentle ripple of water. Zaid sat by the edge, staring at his reflection. I wanted to say something, but the weight of his secret hung heavy between us. I don't know how to break free, he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. You don't have to do it alone, I replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. In the silence that followed, the unspoken connection between us grew stronger. We didn't need words. The desert was listening for us. The sun dipped low over the dunes, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Zaid stood at the edge of the oasis, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. I watched as he took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of unspoken decisions. I'm tired of pretending, he said, his voice steady but resolute. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Then stop, I urged gently. Be who you are, Zaid. He turned to face me, his dark eyes filled with both fear and hope. For the first time, it felt like he was ready to let go of everything holding him back. Under the stars, the desert became a sanctuary. Zaid sat beside me, the silence between us filled with possibilities. He took my hand, his grip firm yet trembling. I don't know what the future holds, he said softly, but I don't want to face it alone. I squeezed his hand. Quiet reassurance, we'll figure it out together. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself had heard his first step toward freedom. In that moment, the desert wasn't just a place, it was the beginning of a journey neither of us could have imagined. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts and tell us what freedom and love mean to you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on notifications to explore more inspiring tales together. Let's celebrate courage, connection, and the beauty of being true to yourself.